Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Goose webinar series. I am Forrest Collins, the program assistant for the Goose Program Office at IOC UNESCO and coordinator of our webinar series. Today's topic is Seagrass Synergy, Collaborate for Global Observing and Understanding. And we are very lucky today to have presenters with us today, Dr. Lena Matwana Nordland, Associate Professor at Uppsala University Department of Earth Science, and Dr. Emmett Duffy, Director, Marine Geo Program, Smithsonian Environmental Research Center. Before I pass over to them, we're just going to do a tiny bit of housekeeping. During the presentation, we will be in the Zoom presentation view, and you'll see the slides. There will be a small screen in the upper right-hand corner with the presenter video box. You may want to adjust your personal view of that to move that video box over to the left or somewhere else, because some of these slides will have QR codes in the upper right-hand corner, and you want to make sure you have access to those and that you can see any other information that's on the slides. So please adjust your personal views to maximize what you see on the slides. And there will be a Slido poll in the middle of the presentation, so keep an eye out for that. The presentation will last approximately 40 minutes, and then there will be a Slido poll following the presentation. You can formulate questions during the presentation or the Slido polls, and then ask them via the Q&A box. And the Q&A session will take place following the presentation and the polls and finish at the top of the hour. And I think that, the session's being recorded, and the recording will be permanently posted on both our website and the YouTube channel. And with it, that will happen within a few days. And if you are registered, which if you're watching, you certainly are, you will get the link immediately following the webinar, where you can view this for a limited time in the Zoom cloud. I think that covers all of the housekeeping. And I will now pass over to our presenters so they can tell us all about Seagrass Synergy.
Thank you, Forrest. Well, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us, our fellow seagrass lovers and ocean enthusiasts. I'm happy to be presenting this webinar today with my colleague, Dr. Lena Nordland, who from Uppsala University, who is an expert in the social and ecological aspects of ecosystems, seagrass ecosystems, which we'll talk a little bit about today. We have been working with a number of others on harmonizing seagrass observations and coordinating so that we can better support management, science of these systems and the human communities that depend on them. And today we'll update you a little bit with that effort. So I'd like to pass it now to Lena.
Thank you so much, Emmett. And also thank you, Emmett, for all the hard work you have dedicated to developing the seagrass as an essential ocean variable over the last couple of years. And it's really a pleasure to continue this development work with this EUV at the Goose Bioeco panel. So today we will talk about envisioning a world with comparable seagrass data across the globe. I will give you more of an overview, and Emmett will tell us more about the details of the Seagrass Essential Ocean Variable. And then, as Forrest said, we will open up for questions. So what is this seagrass? So seagrass are marine flowering plants. So they have flowers, often quite tiny, but they also have roots and rhizomes. So they're actually quite different from algae in that respect. And these roots and rhizomes are important. They are involved, for example, in the carbon sink process. And we can also find the seagrasses almost around the world in intertidal waters, down to quite deep waters, as long as there's enough light for them. So seagrasses are important to nature and people. So the seagrasses are so-called ecosystem engineers. They're creating these meadows or forests underwater, providing habitat for a lot of other species. And these ecosystems also provide many ecosystem services contributing to human well-being. There's often a very high biodiversity in the seagrass, both in the sediment, but also among the plants and above the plants. They're often popular nursery grounds, but also breeding and feeding grounds for species like fish and invertebrates. And this makes seagrasses important fishing grounds, where people are fishing are using all kinds of equipment, from bare hands to large industrial trawls. Seagrasses are also very effective when it comes to carbon sequestration and carbon storage. And the seagrass meadows, especially when it's a lot of larger plants, are also supporting coastal protection, among other things by slowing down the water movement. And also multiple studies have shown that seagrasses contributes to improved water quality. I mean, just look at this. Who doesn't want to jump in and snorkel in this seagrass meadow and look at the sea cucumbers, look at the soothing movement of the seagrass blades? And I would like us to imagine what we could achieve if we had comparable data, seagrass data across the world. And with that said, I would like to introduce a concept of essential variables. A question to you: did anyone check the weather today? I think this is probably one of the most well-known essential variable. The surface temperature. We're also measuring the sea surface temperature, and these together can provide very good forecasts. And I think we're all quite used to having temperature data available to us. We can just check, oh, we're going there. We can just check the weather, or what will the weather be tomorrow? And this is made possible because the data is collected in the same way, and it's made openly available. I think just sort of imagining that we wouldn't have access to temperature data would be kind of strange. We wouldn't know the temperature for tomorrow or in the neighboring village. So why do we have these essential variables? It's not possible. It's just not possible to measure everything at all times. It's way too expensive. It's too time consuming. And the idea behind these essential variables are that they should be a representative selection, but they should also be feasible to measure and sort of give us a more holistic understanding or view. Here in the picture, you can see some of the essential climate variables. They cover the atmosphere and the ocean and the biosphere and more. But the essential ocean variables, they're focusing on the ocean. And it's the Global Ocean Observing System, which is under the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission, UNESCO umbrella. And the GOOS GOOS, the Global Ocean Observing System, is coordinating or aim to coordinate observations in the ocean. And GOOS, they work with developing the essential ocean variable and its framework, and aims to deliver these specification sheets pointing out the essential ocean variables, what to actually measure, but also highlighting the importance of making this data open according to FAIR principles, which means that the data should be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And at GOOS, they have 3 expert panels: the physics and the biogeochemistry panel. They're being a bit more advanced than the biology and ecosystems panel. But the biology and ecosystems panels was also formed more recently. So there are several identified biology and ecosystem EUVs. And they are sort of under the biology and ecosystem panel at GOOS. And one of these essential ocean variables is the seagrass cover and composition. So the reason why seagrass is an essential ocean variable is that it's deemed to be important, but also feasible to measure, and that the impact of measuring this will give us a better understanding of the ocean and of seagrasses, of course. So establishing an essential ocean variable is not a one-time thing. It's a process, and it's an evolving process, and it evolves together with the observing community. That means you. Developing the Seagrass EOV has been a lot about mapping. What are people doing across the planet? What is being measured, and what could actually be possible to measure in all countries, in all areas? The Seagrass EOV, sort of the idea behind this is that one should measure the seagrass percent cover and the seagrass species composition. Those are sort of the minimum requirements to follow the essential ocean variable framework. But Emmett will tell you a little bit more about the details of the Seagrass Essential Ocean Variable. But I have a question for you. Now it's time for you to either bring out your phones and scan the QR code, or you can also, in your web browser, join at slido.com, entering those 7 digits. I'll give you a little while to see if we have some responses coming in. Okay, now I'm going to flip to the next slide, and then we hope this works to see. It's always interesting. We have a lead. We have a lead. This is actually very nice to see that there are already people measuring seagrass percent cover and species composition. But this is also the point that we have looked around to see what is already happening and try to build on that. Thank you, everyone, for engaging. So I want to come back to this. Imagine what if we had comparable seagrass data around the world. So this schematic is sort of just describing the idea of this, that we have either sustained monitoring or actually any observation of seagrass, that if we have this standardized way of, or we decide that we're measuring the seagrass percent cover and the seagrass species composition, of course, along with other variables, but those are sort of the minimum. And we make sure that we enter this data or submit this data to a database or a data repository that can connect and can talk to other data, other places where they also have data. So we can see this data. It becomes available across the world to anyone. And with this data, we can then, for example, make a seagrass distribution map across the Mediterranean. It's not that the data belongs to Europe or to Africa. When we collaborate, when we work together, we can get this much more holistic understanding, and of course, then have a lot more data that can be fed into these kind of data products. Oh, and this, some might think, oh, but we already have an established monitoring program. But I urge you to think about the benefits. First of all, the ocean, it doesn't care about national borders or regions. The ocean is the ocean. And as we know, there are a lot of drivers now making a lot of changes in the ocean, for example, with climate change. But the benefits of having this collaboration and doing this together is, for example, that we can see that in our neighboring region or neighboring country that we have seagrass loss or decrease, or maybe even an increase. Or we can see new species coming in or invasive species, making us more prepared, for example, in the among managers. But also the positive things that when we see, okay, the seagrass is doing really well in one area, maybe in several areas across the globe, we can also start looking into what are they doing? What is happening there? Why is that going so well? So coming together as a community, I think we think we can really improve our understanding of seagrass. And with that, I would like to pass over to Emmett. Thank you.
Thank you, Lena. I am now going to try in real time to share my screen. And here we are. Good. So I would like to build on Lena's point about why it is useful to have this harmonization and coordination. And a really nice example comes from coral reef environments. So some years ago, the Global Coral Reef Monitoring Network commissioned an assessment and evaluation of Caribbean coral reefs, which have been under a lot of threat. This work was led by Jeremy Jackson and colleagues, and they produced a very valuable report, but it could have been much better, as they themselves mentioned. And as they say, there's an urgent need to develop simple, standardized monitoring protocols. This came out because after spending 2 years on collecting data, much of it ended up being unusable because of inconsistencies, formatting errors, diversity of metrics, and so on, and also because of inadequate metadata, that is, information on the locations, depths, who collected, and so on. And one can sense their frustration in the conclusion that the situation is inexcusable and no one should ever have to go through such an exercise again. So one of the several goals we have with the Seagrass EOV is to ensure that the seagrass community does not have to go through such a situation and has comparable data. So Lena asked us to imagine a world where we have global seagrass data. We're doing a lot of imagining here. Imagine what we could do with that. Well, we don't have to imagine that for phytoplankton because we actually have globally standardized data, for the most part, for in-water sampling and also for satellite remote sensing, which has completely revolutionized our understanding of how the ocean ecosystem works, with relatively strong global characterization of where ocean primary productivity is, and it's how it's changing. We would like to achieve something similar for seagrasses, and for that matter, for other essential ocean variables in the goose group. So that was the vision of a number of us that came together under the name of Sea-Grass, Coordinated Global Research Assessment of Seagrass Systems, in order to produce a rigorous dynamic picture of global seagrass status and trends. I should warn you that that is still underway. We will not present the final product of that today, but also because we need a global community of practice that can help us get there. So we didn't invent this idea, obviously. There have been many people working to bring together seagrass and other kinds of data to maximize their global value for a number of years. And just a very brief account of where that's come from. Really harmonizing and coordinating seagrass monitoring started probably 25 years ago with 2 major seagrass networks, Seagrass Net, Seagrass Watch. More recently, our program in the Smithsonian's Marine Geo has been doing similar things. This kind of harmonization for global observing, as Lena mentioned, really took off with the framework for ocean observing that proposed the EOVs back in 2009. It was several years later that the biology EOVs, Essential Ocean Variables, really got off the ground. And there's been a lot of coordination and consulting since then to come to where we are now. So what we are doing now is proposing these global standards for seagrass cover and composition. That is the Essential Ocean Variable. We'll tell you a little bit about the data. And I just want to mention here that much of what we're talking about here is the subject of a manuscript that is in progress to explain the EOV, and we will be very keen to hear from anyone who has comments on that might be useful there. So again, the Seagrass Essential Ocean Variable is called seagrass cover and composition. So those two components, cover and composition, are the minimum requirements for reporting on the seagrass EOV. And we recognize that not everyone has the same resources. People are using different methods and so on. So we are promoting what we call a data quality model. This is really modeled on what David Obura and colleagues did for the coral reef EOV, that where we have a nested group of variables, the minimum, and then others that can be added on to that. So there are many ways of measuring cover and composition. For example, in the water, by counting what's in a quadrat like we have on the left here. This can be done through drop camera photos, drones, even high resolution imagery. The EOV is agnostic about exactly how that's done, which we'll come back to. The key thing is to have a measure of cover. The other component is species composition. That is, what seagrass species, and for that matter, others, are in that quadrat. So those are the minimum requirements. But of course, seagrass systems are more complex than simply cover and species composition. The physical structure of the seagrass canopy is of major importance for supporting animals, for wave attenuation and coastline protection, and also it determines the biomass, or is related to the biomass of seagrass there, and also carbon sequestration. So the second level of the quality model, the data quality model, is to add seagrass density, that is number of shoots per square meter, for example, and canopy height to that those initial cover and composition measures. And then finally, we recognize that, and I'm about to have David Attenborough here, which I didn't mean to have, speaking about this. We also recognize that the seagrass plants themselves that we've been talking about so far support a vibrant ecosystem of animals. And so the Global Ocean Observing System has developed or is developing additional essential ocean variables for fishes, macroalgae, megafauna, and others that live within these seagrass systems. So bringing this all together, we can organize this in the data quality model that I mentioned. So up in the top row here, we have the seagrass EOV itself, and then below that, some of the other essential ocean variables that are useful for characterizing the broader seagrass ecosystem. Algal cover, algae can be important both in fueling the food web and in competing with seagrass. And then at the bottom, some of the animals that are also found there, fishes, we have them for megafauna as well. Let's go to the top row very briefly, and that just shows what I've just mentioned, the quality levels. Number one, the most basic minimum requirement, cover, species composition, could be functional composition if taxonomic knowledge is not available locally. And then secondly, the seagrass structure. So in other words, this is an organization in a nested structure of what must be measured, and then some of the others that add value. So that's all great to talk about. The question is, how does one do this? So you're going out in the field, you've got your boat, you've got some gear. How do you measure the seagrass EOV? So there are, of course, numerous specific protocols for doing that. And as I mentioned, the concept of an essential ocean variable is deliberately agnostic about the specific methods that one uses to measure seagrass. It is a variable which has units, for example, cover, percent cover within some area. And it is intentionally not connected to a specific protocol for the reason that part of the goal is to bring together similar data that whether or not they were collected in the same way. Obviously, there's some quality control needed there, but that's the goal, to bring together as much data as possible. So how do we do that? Well, there are, as I mentioned, a number of protocols and other resources that are available. I'll just mention three here. I mentioned before some of the pioneering seagrass networks, SeagrassNet, Seagrass Watch, both of which have data from hundreds of sites over large areas. On the left, we have our Marine Geo Toolkit. That is, all of these are open access and available, and we will show you some QR codes for how you get them at the end of the talk. So just to take the Smithsonian's Marine Geo Toolkit, which I know best, what we provide, which again is similar to the others, is first a document that clearly explains how to make the measurements, what equipment you need, roughly how long it will take, what needs to be done, and then a field data sheet that organizes how one writes down the field data while you're out there doing it. And then finally, a data entry template. So this is an Excel file or CSV that organizes the data that you collect in such a way that it can be shared easily and is in a standard format for integration, for example, into the Ocean Biodiversity Information System, which is where we favor having all of this data go ultimately. And that segues naturally into the data management system for the data, what we call the data schema, which allows this data to be shared relatively easily and synthesize. So by the data schema, we simply mean a set of sort of standards and a format for reporting the data in a way that can then be widely used. And again, this is part of the manuscript that is underway right now. The data schema is an Excel spreadsheet that organizes the seagrass data that are outlined in the protocols, so that they can be easily imported into OBIS, the Ocean Biodiversity Information System. This has explanations in README and so on. So we have resources for how one collects the data, where one puts the data, and how to do that. But what really, what really will realize the power of interoperable, comparable data like this is when many people around the world are using those protocols and sharing them together. And one way that has been really increased over the years is through some of these observing networks, I might say very broadly. And so for seagrasses, again, SeagrassNet and Seagrass Watch have done tremendous work in this area. I've mapped here some of the sites where they've sampled. This is as of several years ago, as well as those where we're sampling in Smithsonian Marine Geo. And then there are a number of projects, more temporary projects or one-off things, such as the Zostra Experimental Network that we organized a few years ago that sampled 50 sites around. So by bringing all these data together, we can begin to get a really strong picture of global seagrass status and to some degree trends. And then, of course, there are other networks that can allow those seagrass data to link to other ocean biology and ocean environmental conditions. Notably, the Marine Biodiversity Observation Network, which is focused on advancing the EOVs, but many, many others, as you can see here, which you'll be happy to know I'm not going to talk about individually. And then finally, I'd like to mention another important role or another important means of collecting these global data worldwide, which has really come up in the last 10 or so years, and that is the use of community science through social media, for example. Many of you are familiar with iNaturalist and perhaps big fans, as I am, but there is also a biodiversity reporting app, if I might call it that, specifically for seagrasses, and this is Seagrass Spotter. And this map shows the richness and distribution of observations that have been made through that Seagrass Spotter app. So all you need to do is have a geo-referenced location where you're sampling, take a picture of it, and assuming that the picture is good, the app will allow you to register what you saw where. So just to summarize that, in order to really realize the vision of global harmonized seagrass data that can support the things we're interested in, we need clear protocols. Again, these can be, there are various options here, but our goal is to sort of make this as easy as possible for people who are coming into this field for the first time. So standardized protocols, a data system that can ingest that data and share it and share back to you. And then those are then available for you and the rest of the community to do global science, larger scale science than at your own location, as well as applying that to management, conservation, sustainable development. And that, of course, raises the question, what are we going to do with all this data? Why is it valuable? How can we use it? There are a large number of possible applications. Excuse me, one of the big global ones at this point is providing ground validation for satellite observations of seagrass, which are increasing all the time, excuse me, as they are for other kinds of habitats, both on land and sea. So I'll just mention a couple of specific ones here. The first one comes from the Seagrass network I've mentioned, which was founded by Fred Short at the University of New Hampshire back in the late 90s. And that involves the Seagrass net sampling involves a series of 3 transects from right near the shoreward edge off. All of them are done in the same way. And quarterly sampling of seagrass. So this is one example of a time series from New Hampshire, USA, of a decline in seagrass that was then attributed to grazing by Canada geese, and that there is probably a climate warming element to the explanation here, because Canada geese have begun to overwinter up in the northern parts of the United States and Canada, where they had formerly not done. And so when they're overwintering, they're eating this grass and causing a decline. So that monitoring allowed some sense of how that was happening and over what time course. A second example that I'll mention concerns another factor affecting eelgrass, which is wasting disease. Wasting disease is caused by I think it's a slime net, which is a kind of protist that actually knocked out seagrass through almost all of the North Atlantic back in the 1930s with an epidemic, and it flares up from time to time elsewhere, including along the West Coast of North America. So a few years ago, we conducted a study that sampled seagrass, eelgrass communities using our Smithsonian Marine Geo protocols across 32 sites from San Diego to Alaska across 3 years. And the purpose of this was to try to begin to understand both the environmental and the community or biological interactions that influence wasting disease prevalence and severity. And with the first results coming out of this, which were a study led by Lillian Aoki that came out in Illinois a couple of years ago, showed that across this range, there was an increase in wasting disease prevalence and severity with the temperature anomaly, the warm temperature anomaly. So in other words, not just the temperature, but in places where the temperatures were warmer than they are normally found at that site, there were increases in wasting disease. So this is potentially useful in thinking about what sites may or may not be useful as refuges from climate as we go forward. So just a couple of examples there of the kinds of inferences and applications that can come from harmonizing seagrass data across time and space. So just to summarize here, what we really need in order to achieve this vision of globally harmonized data and everything that can come from that is a flow of information and work from collecting field data using rigorous protocols, focusing on the EOV, that is this nested set of subvariables, as Goose calls them, cover and composition being the two most important minimum requirements, but others that can add value, bringing those to a shared data system, and those then can support a number of benefits, as Lena mentioned, invasive species alerts, understanding degradation and restoration, and other more scientific goals. So with that, we would like to say thank you. I'll leave this up for just a minute, which shows the how you can get access to some of the protocols and other resources from Smithsonian Marine Geo, SeagrassNet, Seagrass Watch, and the Seagrass Spotter app. And we will soon open it up for your questions. But before that, we have a couple of additional questions for you. And I'm going to turn it over to Lena here, and we'll just leave this up, I think, Lena, or did you want to show your screen?
I can show my screen. I'll continue with this slide.
Okay.
Now you have those QR codes back. So as Emmett said, it's time for the Q&A. But first we have questions for you. So it's time for some more Slido. Let's see if I can, like that. So to participate in the Slido again, you either can scan the QR code with your phone, or you can join at slido.com entering those 7 numbers. But we are a bit curious to know what you think are the biggest challenges to achieving globally comparable seagrass data. And we posted here just a few suggestions, and it's multiple choice, so you can cross multiple. But we are curious to understand more about the constraints, and then something also that, of course, we could talk about in the Q&A session. I'll give you a few more seconds to actually think about this before I show what's coming up on the screen. I can see I misspelled something also. Oops. Okay, this is very interesting. Yeah, so we do see some constraints, and that is very important to acknowledge, because otherwise we don't know what to address and what we should do to be able to achieve something like this. But I think what I've heard, or when Emmett and we've been out in the seagrass community, is that we already have a monitoring program. What should we do? This is nice. This is 48 people already that have responded. Excellent. But would you like to say something about this, Emmett?
Sure. Yeah, I'm not sure when we're moving from this into the others, but I think this is quite interesting, that we need to change the current monitoring program because that speaks directly to the purpose of the essential ocean variables, which are intended to allow different kinds of monitoring programs to participate based on what they're already doing. So I mean, to say it very simply, I think what I would say is if your program is measuring cover in some way and species composition, you don't have to change it. That is, at least in principle, of the right kind to contribute to the EOV.
Yeah, but they might be able to, they might measure it, but it's where to put the data. This is also very interesting.
Right. So that's a different matter. That's one of the ones below. It takes too much extra time. I don't know where to submit. So yeah, all of which are entirely valid issues.
Yeah. I will move on to the next slide. Now we're switching this to something more positive, thinking again about the benefits. And I would really like you to think positive, maybe even dream big and bold, and think about seagrass. And what do you think would be the biggest benefits of globally comparable seagrass data? Here you can enter text yourself. We are also looking forward to see maybe some questions in the Q&A little box here in Zoom. So if you would like to post here, as well as some questions for me and Emmett.
Is it cheating if I answer our own question?
No, please do. We can see if we can pick it out. And for you that don't have the opportunity to write something now, do think about it. And also for you that will watch this as a recording, do take a piece of paper and write down what you think could be the biggest benefits of globally comparable seagrass data. I'm a little bit curious. Should I? I think I will. Ooh,
By the way, these answers will be very helpful to us in developing the manuscript that comes reporting the EOV specifications. Thank you.
So we see, oh, I'm sorry. Shouldn't move things too much. So we can see there's, wow, there's so much coming in. Wow, let's give this another 1 or 2 minutes, and then we are moving on to the Q&A as well. And we recognize that a lot of you are writing on a small phone with small buttons to press. Yeah, I see a lot of input here about the possibilities to get this large scale understanding. something, in my opinion, that I think is really an advantage. I saw some comments about that. Often you have local problems or local challenges, or you're doing a local monitoring program. And with this kind of data set, you could identify other places that but potentially has the same kind of challenges, and you can learn from each other. I could see that as a very positive thing. Or you might have heard about this bright spot concept, that there are a couple of places. It seems like there's a couple of places that are doing really, really well, and then try to go there and see what are they doing. Why is this working really well here? Why is the seagrass, whatever, flourishing? Why, and becoming more and more, while we're in other places have a decline, for example, to sort of identify those areas. I think for many, we absolutely a ground truthing tool that we can use this data to make distribution maps and understand where we have this resource. So we also know where to do the conservation, where to do maybe protection, etc. I mean, I work in Sweden, and just around the island where I live, we don't really have a full map of seagrass yet. We're working on it, and yeah, this is something that we need to sort of address. Okay, I think we will close this section now. If someone wants to continue adding on here, please do. I will change the slide to a beautiful seagrass picture. So we can also look at spend these last 15 minutes on addressing the questions and answers. Thank you so much, everyone, for contributing here.
Yes, thank you very much. And I think we can go to the Q&A that have been written in. And there's one here at the top, Lena, that I think might be better for you to take as a result of your current EU project. So this is from Pedro Montero, who asks about eModNet SBH. How useful is the eModNet composite data to you?
The simple answer is I don't really know, but this is something that I will definitely dig into to learn more about. But I know that eModNet and OBIS and other of these big data hubs are sort of collaborating to make sure that they can communicate with each other.
Yeah, and very broadly, I would say, as the scale of the seagrass or other habitat surveying increases, so that we do have these global data sets or large scale regional data sets, that there's a lot of kind of global scale environmental data out there, eModNet, there's BioOracle and so on, and climate modeling products that then become available, many of which are actually sort of more appropriate for looking at large scale patterns than for local scale patterns. So it really opens up some interesting analyses.
Yes.
So Lena is typing about other possible responses. I'll just go right down the line to how can I measure species composition, and can I measure this in terms of percentages? So the answer is, of course, one has to have some taxonomic knowledge, and I think both Seagrass Watch and Seagrass Net have provided some guides to seagrass species from different regions. So that would be, I think, a first place to look for how to identify particular species. And yes, it is certainly possible to talk about percentages by species. For example, in one of these quadrats that I showed earlier, oftentimes the way to do it is by counting the number of dots with crossing lines in the field, and each one of those could be a species. So you might have 60% of one species A and 40% of species B, for example.
Yeah, and I see one question from Carmen, and it's about the seagrass EOV, if it's both the species composition and the cover. And yes, it's both. Those two are the minimum requirements for meeting the EOV framework. But that doesn't mean that just measuring the composition or cover is not valuable data. Of course it is. And should, of course, also, if possible, be submitted to as open data. But to have both, then you meet the minimum requirements for the EOV.
Yeah, this is a great question because especially for remote sensing, much of that data is in some cases struggling to distinguish seagrass from other, macroalgae and so on. So if, having seagrass extent without species composition is of course very valuable. The idea here with these being the two key things are that species composition, of course, makes a big difference to much of the ecosystem structure and growth and carbon sequestration and so on. Perennial species are doing very different things than ephemeral species. So I would say if one only has cover, for example, from remote sensing, then that puts a priority on trying to get some ground validation or ground truthing data from sites within that range that can help understand what the species are.
Yeah. I would actually also like to mention one thing. As part of the Global Ocean Observing System, we are just supporting the coordination of this. This is for us, all of you, to have this data so everyone can use this data so that we together as a seagrass community, as a seagrass family, can advance our understanding of seagrass, enable that seagrass comes into global assessments, because the data will be good enough so it can actually sort of really contribute to for example, the IPBES global assessment of seeing what's happening in the oceans. So this is, the idea is that this is for all of us, that anyone can use this data to sort of really advance the understanding. One might only need, if you're in Colombia, for example, you might only need, for your purposes, data from your neighboring countries. While if you want to produce a global map of seagrass distribution, you would like to leverage all of this data. So I would say it very much depends on what you want to use the data for. And having these two minimum requirements, this is just the first step to get us as a global community to sort of really try to come together and see what power can we unleash by doing this. There's a lot of questions.
Which is good. Yes, which is good. I think I'm going to move around a little bit here. A lot of them are about remote sensing, and I know I can't answer those questions. I'm not sure if Lena can either. We're basically old school marine biologists that get in the water. I should only speak for myself, Lena, but I don't have the expertise there. We can make a few comments on that. You know, how can satellite image tools specifically help the projects? There's a huge and growing role for satellite remote sensing, as many of you know a lot better than I do. You know, there are new satellites going up with higher resolution, hyperspectral imagery, and so on. So, you know, one hopes that in time it will be possible to really get really high resolution data. But in the meantime, I think the way that those two can interact very, very productively is by talking with each other and saying, where do we really need the ground truthing data or validation, as however one might want to say that.
I could add on there, because if you look at a lot of the other essential ocean variables, they have buoys, they're measuring things sort of in real time all over the ocean. So also, the more data that can be connected to remote sensing, the better you can train you can call it the programs, so they get better and better in identifying what is actually seen on these images. And as you said, I mean, the satellite imagery gets better and better. And there are some attempts to sort of see if you can also map seagrass species.
I want to go down to the question by Natalia Gallo about blue carbon measurements. As everyone knows, I think there's a huge interest in seagrass, as there is in some other coastal wetland species, as blue carbon reservoirs. And so this question is about an EU, whoops, it's going away, Marco Polo project that will soon launch a data call. And so I think my general answer to that would be that part of what we're advocating here, the sharing of data and especially metadata, should be able to really help these kinds of questions about who has data on what, you know, and also about, if you have blue carbon data, understanding better the system that it came from. So I think, you know, connecting those together, making sure the metadata, if you were to submit data to OBIS, for example, making sure that either includes the blue carbon data, which is possible now with the event core structure of OBIS, or it at least talks about it in the metadata so that it's possible to search for that. And that would allow those like Natalia who are looking for that data to better connect with colleagues who have it.
Yes, and also I know that OBIS is part of the Marco Polo project, which is great. You can continue, Emmett. I see that you would like to also answer Jose's.
Yeah, I'm looking through the list. Is there something that jumps out to you, Lena, while I'm doing this? I'm afraid I can't answer the questions about specific remote sensing, as we've mentioned. Jose Luis Moutinho asks about citizen science. Absolutely, there's a role there. We mentioned the Seagrass Spotter app. You know, that there are observations of seagrass on iNaturalist as well. So those are certainly important, valuable sources of information. And it looks like we may be getting close to the end here.
We might have time for one more quick question, if there's one that you see that you're burning to answer before we bring things to a close.
I would like to answer a question from Alice Pohl. It's about what, in your opinion, is the most useful subvariables of the coverage and composition. You mentioned height. I would say, I mean, there are a lot of different variables that one could measure. But the beautiful thing here is that you can also adapt this to your local context. So what are you interested to answer in your specific setting? What do you think are, for example, the drivers of change that you might want to measure those? Or maybe you also want a better understanding of that shallow ocean part or your bay, and you need to sort of combine different essential ocean variables and also a lot of supporting variables. Do you have any last 1 minute thing?
Okay, first of all, in case I get cut off, I want to say that this has been incredibly useful to us to have your responses. So thank you all for coming in very much. And I'm just going to answer Carmen's question about a site to submit the data. We're using OBIS.
Yes. Oh, and OBIS is already exactly. It's already possible to use. And they are using the so-called Darwin Core compliant. So it's a data language that makes it possible to communicate with other data repositories.
And when we eventually get this manuscript out, it will have a data schema template for upload to OBIS.
I also want to say thank you. So many amazing questions that we haven't had time to respond to yet. And thank you for all your responses to Slido. And I have seen at the peak, I think we were over 100 participants, which I think is fantastic. I also know a lot of people signed up so they can watch this as a recording later.
Thanks, everyone. Go Seagrass.
Yeah. Woo, woo. Forrest, you're on mute.